2011 is when I started doing data science. Big data was back actually during the last recession, 2008. Uh, yeah, I've seen kind of how things have progressed, and I learned a lot of lessons along the way. I drank the Kool-Aid just like everybody else too, but I realized a lot of what we were seeing out there eventually was going to hit a wall, and we've kind of been seeing that come to fruition now. And so things like maturing your data practice is very timely for a lot of organizations right now, I believe.
It's interesting. Before we were talking, before we started the meeting, we had a kind of a interesting dialogue about data science and I guess the recession that just walloped us in the face. Do you want to touch on that a bit?
Yeah, well, the comment I had made was that when is because a lot of people that are not in the space they kind of get upset. So when I was at Target, the guy who's behind the pregnant teen story that I assume most of you heard about, he actually was not in data science, and he was not considered a data scientist at Target. He was considered traditional BI. And he grumbled one time when we were having a one-on-one conversation saying, "Hey, you data science guys coming here moving 100 miles per hour and making me look like I'm a turtle." And so we just started having a frank conversation, and he said, there seems to be a lot of hype going on in data science. And at the time, there was. This was 2015. And he said, "When do you think this will all end?" And I said, "The next recession." Because the hype is definitely outweighing what we were seeing in terms of benefits across the board, and it just was not sustainable. In fact, last year, United Health Group, their chief data officer said they did over 1,000 data science experiments, and not one of them produced a viable business project. And he said his response was, "It was a good learning lesson." And I'm sitting there going, "You got to get fired. 1,000 experiments and not one of them produced a good result. That's just, yeah, to me that's insane." I mean, the failure rate in data science, depending on who you listen to, is anywhere from 70 to 90%. He's basically saying they hit 100% failure rate. I mean, you kind of have to work at that to get to that number. But it's, the failure rate, even if you just take the middle of 80%, it's still very high. And that says there's a lot of problems in the space if you're getting that high of a failure rate. So there has to be lessons learned that are currently not being learned. And I've seen a lot of organizations that have some just crazy setups that literally just have an environment that just create failure from the get-go. And there's a lot of underlying aspects to that, which it's more process than data. And that's sort of the problem. We're so focused on the data, we forget bad processes. It's just like, you can't out exercise a bad diet. It's the same thing. You can't out code bad processes.
Can you give some examples of some of the bad processes that you've seen?
Yeah, I won't name the company, but there was this one organization I ran into last year where their data science team did not want to actually talk to the internal customers. So they created a separate team that would actually go out and talk to the other business units and then bring that information to the data science team. So the data scientists never actually interacted with the internal business users. So they never really understood the business problems. And for me, the best way to really understand a problem is through stories. Observations through stories are really the best way to understand what's happening because, yeah, I always hear this answer like, "Well, we always just listen to the data." Well, the data doesn't give you really a good understanding of intent. And was having this conversation with a company yesterday where they're hitting the wall with people not wanting to use their data. And I said, "Well, the problem is your data is really good at location data, but it doesn't give me intent." And I said, "Look, I go to Target just to kind of wander around because, well, there's nothing else to do. Everything else is closed here. But 9 times out of 10, I walk out not buying anything. I just want to get out of the house." So you have no idea my intent. You can give that information to Target and they think, "Hey, Edward went to the local Target 3 times this week." Yeah, and I bought ice cream once. that doesn't give them any intent data, but that's really what they truly would want to go after. And that's why stories are so important in terms of understanding insights. Without that, you're just missing so much. And I see that all the time. The data scientists, they don't really want to interact with people, so they just miss out on so much.
I guess question for the audience, does this ring a bell to you guys or seem familiar, different?
I'm nodding my head quite a bit right now. Not in our current team, but I think the previous incarnation at Avanti was very, very much in this vein where the data scientists were not talking to our internal customers and were not building products. They had, I mean, it was astounding. And so I'm really kind of, you're preaching to the choir here.
Yeah, and it's something I've seen over and over again. When I used to be a product manager at GE over a decade ago, and we were required to be out in the field interacting with customers every 2 weeks. And that's something I've tried to instill in teams I've worked with is get out in the field. Like when I was at Best Buy, I usually would take my Friday afternoon and go to the stores just to see what was happening because I wanted to get that understanding of, well, how are people actually shopping? Because I understood, yes, the data gives us only one aspect of it. And it's something like when I was at CH Robinson, there was actually two data science teams, one that I ran and then another one that somebody else decided they needed their own team. They never even went out and talked to the sales reps. So they would create these algorithms like prickly recommenders for the sales reps, and the sales reps would come back and say, "This is the complete opposite of what I need." So you just spent $1 million building something nobody actually wanted. And I was like, if you had just gone and talked to them in the first place, you could have solved that uh, and actually given them what they were looking for in the first place. But again, they just thought, hey, I'll just look at the data and that'll give me all I need. And like I said, without understanding that complexity of the people behind the data, the data itself is really just two-dimensional. And whenever I hear the answer, I just look at the data. I'm like, well, what is data? Can you show me the actual data? And it's kind of a trick question because data to me is always interpretive. Whether it's slides, whether it's an algorithm, whether it's code, it's always interpreted, and how that person's biases were baked into that interpretation really influences what we're seeing at the end of the day. And that's why to me being really story based is truly important. And it's also why we miss a lot of insights is flawed beliefs is probably one of the biggest drivers for missed insights. And that's something I consistently see across the board. When I was at Target, they had set up a personalization team before I arrived, but their algorithms were not hitting the normal numbers you'd expect to see for the type of recommenders they're doing, like collaborative filtering or persona based and true one-to-one. That's because the team that built the algorithms, the belief systems and the assumptions built into the algorithms were based off of how they shop, which was basically a bunch of single guys out in Silicon Valley. Well, Target's average customer is over 85% female. They built an algorithm based for single guys, not for women. And that really played a huge difference. Once we went through and really cleaned out the assumptions and biases in the algorithm and made them much more in tune for how the average target shopper is, then we were actually seeing the results that you would have expected to see for those type of algorithms.
That's interesting. How would you clean up the biases in a data set like that? I think bias is a pretty popular topic these days in data science. What are some approaches that you took?
Well, that I took a very different approach than a lot of teams. So I am not a purist. I love seeing these Venn diagrams on like LinkedIn and stuff where people are like, this is data science. And I'm like, well, yeah, I've run data science teams, but to me is it's always what am I actually trying to achieve here? I mean, to me, data science is a tool. It's a way to achieve some type of result. So when I actually look at these problems I'm trying to solve, which is in that situation, it's how do I better get engagement with my customers? Target had what they called an anthropology team, which essentially had a bunch of social scientists, anthropologists, linguists, psychologists, and I had actually run into that team, and they actually wanted to find a project to work on. So I was like, hey, I've used behavioral science in the past. Let's get together and figure out if we can clean this up. Now, the personalization guys did not like this at all, but you couldn't argue with the results, which was we cleaned up the algorithms, and they had the understanding of human behavior, human triggers, the anthropology team that was beyond my skill set, and I trusted that they knew what they were doing because these people had experience in this space, and they were able to really get in there and figure out how to make the algorithms work better. And that's something I've just continued to use is behavioral science, cyber psychology, behavioral economics, the various social sciences. Because to me, when it comes to really solving those problems, it's a human activity we're often trying to deal with here, not necessarily data itself. Because if you ask any CEO, they're not interested in the data per se. They're interested in what the data can help them achieve, which is usually some type of business result. So that's really where I focus my mindset on, and I find a lot of times I'm dealing with, and it's great that people are passionate about what they do. I'll deal with data scientists that think data science is the answer to everything, and there are certain time periods too where they get kind of obsessed with tools like back in 2015 and 16, whatever your problem was, Spark was the answer. That was kind of the joke going around at the time. But there was some truth to that. You ask anybody, it's like, hey, how would you solve this? Usually Spark was going to be dropped somewhere in that conversation at that point in time. Of course, now, then we got into the whole deep learning and cloud and so on. So there is some of that, I call it the high school mentality, whatever's popular, everybody kind of goes towards. And it's sort of a detriment to the practice, in my opinion. There really needs to be taking a step back, get out of your comfort zone and really look at what's the bigger problem here. And I actually gave a presentation with another guy, David Quimby, a few years ago called The Softer Side of Data Science, where actually a lot of conferences on data science turned us down because they didn't feel it was relevant. That we said, if you really want to be successful in data science, mastering soft skills is just as important as mastering the hard skills of learning code and math and so on. Because I can tell you that ability to really go in there and understand what people are saying, even though they don't know how to articulate it, is one of the best skill sets I have when it comes to actually solving problems. And I've done that where I was working with Microsoft on a project where they kept talking about predictive analytics left and right. And I realized they weren't actually describing predictive analytics. They were describing prescriptive analytics, but they didn't know the difference. But since I did, I was able to really understand and say, hey, is this what you're trying to look for as a scenario? This is kind of the outcome. They're like, yeah. So if I just gone off what they had literally said, I would have created the wrong solution for them. They would have come back and said, that's not what we actually wanted. So those softer skills, I think, are really critical. And for me, the more and more I play with data, the more I look at things and I say, the algorithms are actually sometimes the easiest part. Dealing with people is oftentimes the harder part. Building a process that's going to create new habits is often the harder part. At the end of the day, if you can master those two pieces, you find out the algorithm creation actually becomes pretty easy at the end of the day. At least in comparison to the other two aspects, I should say.
It's a question for the audience. What do the rest of you guys think about that?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think I would probably say that so I've entered Starbucks, HBO, DocuSign, a lot of these companies who have these aspirations to whether do personalization, gamification, or just have a problem with even analytics. And then one of the first things that I usually do during that journey is to just take a look at how mature they are from an organization perspective. And I really first start with data and where the heck their data is, where do they capture it, how fresh is it, and you often do see cases where you have large armies of data scientists who or quite frankly, trying to extract insights out of data that is for shit, to be quite honest. It's really poor data. I'm kind of going through this right now at DocuSign. They have armies and armies of data scientists. The business, I mean, they're multiplying like rabbits. And the sad part is that the product isn't even instrumented to collect any product-related data. The data that they're using is primarily log data that developers use to debug the apps. So it's a lot of times when I enter in these places, it's first of all getting data in place, but also, as Edward kind of mentions too, is what is the meaning behind that data as well. It's a very common pattern.
Yeah, that is something that definitely resonated with me, and I think it's one part of it to be able to listen to what your stakeholders want. Another very important part that a lot of people overlook is also being able to sell yourself and sell your team's capabilities. If people don't know what sorts of problems data science can actually solve, then they'll ask you the wrong questions and your conversations won't go in the right direction. So, eat brown bags about stuff that your team is working on to go a long way to showing some of those capabilities. Your leadership has to be able to manage expectations about the sorts of problems that data can solve. It's not just give them some data and they'll figure it out, and AI, all the things. You got to be able to manage those expectations. And so, yeah, those soft skills and being able to have that outreach effort and, marketing your team. Marketing is kind of a four-letter word within data science, but you got to be able to do that effectively among your organization, so other people are willing to come to you. It's got to be that two-way street.
Well, I guess, why do you think it is that data scientists tend to take like a data-centric approach and maybe ignore or maybe I guess dismiss softer skills and things like setting expectations, getting visibility, and communication?
I feel like we get so deep into the weeds of things that we figure that the data is just going to tell us the truth, and other people will believe that truth. And because we are so enmeshed in that culture that it's hard to have the empathy to see from other people's experiences. Other people aren't playing with the data, and they might not trust the conclusions that you come to. And so, it's in many ways it's just speaking a different language, I think.
Yeah, it is. This past fall, I gave a workshop at the University of Minnesota at the School of Statistics, where a lot of the data scientists are learning, and it was one of the asks that I was presented with was, can you teach the students the need for a multidisciplinary approach? The head of statistics, he was saying that the students actually had this belief that any class that they took outside of their core skill set meant another 10 to 20,000 off their salary that they would get once they leave school. And I was like, I don't know anybody that actually looks at the classes you take in school. So yeah, that was a bit silly, their notion, but it makes sense. When I look at a lot of the programs, at least here in the Midwest where I am, they don't really teach students a lot of the things that are going to help them to sell themselves or create empathy with someone else within the organization. And for me, coming out of when I went to school, I actually studied international business and branding. I didn't actually study analytics. My first job was a market analyst, but I had to really understand those aspects of human behavior and how does that really play within the market. And that, I think, has helped me out quite a bit. I've run into a lot of people that have been on my team, and I work with a guy. I've worked with him since Target. He's probably one of the top 5 data scientists in the Twin Cities when it comes to coding and algorithm creation, and he can blow me out of the water on that space any day of the week. But interacting with people, sitting in and trying to talk with people and really learn the true business case, I think he'd rather just go to the dentist and get his teeth drilled without any painkillers. It's just not his thing, and that's fine. I think as long as it's to me, data science and data practices have always been a team effort, and it's finding where everybody's good at. And he just loves drilling down into the data, building those algorithms. Whereas I'm more comfortable going out there, finding the problems that we need to solve, and then we figure out what's that handshake between the two of us, so that we can have a good flow of our work going on. And like I said, we've been working together for years here, 5 years now, and it's that's something I sometimes find is lacking on some teams, particularly the younger teams, where everyone's trying to kind of show that they know their stuff. They just want to get in there and prove themselves, and that can sometimes be a detriment. So there needs to be a strong leader that knows how to corral that type of team. But this guy that I've been working with, John, he's kind of getting to that point where he wants to retire. He's 60, and he got into the whole field back in the 80s, back when it was really new. And he was in university back when they were using punch cards. So it's kind of fun talking to him to see how things have changed over the years.
Oh, wow. Yeah, but things have changed a bit. So, on another topic, when we were I guess chatting before everyone showed up, we were talking about forecast models and maybe the impact that the last couple of months have had on those as well. You want to go into that a bit?
Yeah. So one of the things, like particularly with retail, and people have been complaining about saying, hey, I still go to the store and I can't find the things that I'm looking for. And why is that? And one of the things is, we've seen over the last few years, as data and data science has become very popular, every CEO and executive is going out there saying, yeah, we're a data driven culture, blah blah blah. And they don't know what the hell that means anyways. But the thing is, what that translated into was a lot of teams were given leeway in this space to build algorithms. And I can tell you, most executives have no way of understanding how to create the good checks and balances to make sure that the right algorithms are being created. So a lot of people just went for simple algorithms, a bunch of assumptions, essentially a bunch of algorithms that are if statements. And so they're looking at, well, this is how people have been shopping for the last 5 years. So this is probably how things are going to go forward. Now you all of a sudden get into the coronavirus. Now for me, this year has been very interesting. So I was supposed to go to China early this year. And like I normally do, I would check to see, well, what's happening where I'm going. Not because I expect something bad to happen, but I was like, hey, maybe there's some kind of cool festival. And hey, isn't Chinese New Year supposed to be around that time? Maybe I can go to something fun. Then I hear about what's going on in Wuhan, and I'm just like, it was almost like watching, when you're on the highway and you see a car accident, you kind of slow down to kind of see. It was sort of this kind of curiosity, what's happening. But then when I saw they shut the city down, I'm like, that's not normal. Something's up here. And so I was telling the wife, let's just kind of stock up. So back in January and March and through early March, we're just slowly stocking up. So then in early March and mid-March, when everyone else clues into what's going on, we're sitting at home just sort of watching what's happening. And I'd been telling people back in February, go buy toilet paper, and everyone's just kind of looking at me like I probably got cabin fever or something. But I understood what was going to happen when you have it's called the adjustment principle. When people realize something's about to really change and change your normal life, they tend to swing in a very extreme direction towards one way or another. Things like toilet paper, it just makes sense when you really think about it. It's a comfort thing. You want to be able to have toilet paper because it gives you a sense of normalcy. So this whole frenzy didn't surprise me. And I saw a stat like in 4 weeks, people bought 9 months worth of toilet paper, which is just insane. Now, take that to the algorithms that were being created in the retail locations. They were never designed for this type of scenario. So they're essentially flying blind in terms of, a lot of them were saying, hey, we want to have predictive capabilities. We want to be able to predict what people are going to do and what they're going to buy. But those are based off of assumptions on a normal behavior. And we haven't seen normal behavior. Right now, people are starting to get to that point where they're saying, I'm done with this. I want to get back to the way things were. But I still go to the store and there's rationing on like eggs and milk. There's still a lot of stuff that's out of stock in many of the stores. So that to me says that we needed to take into account that there are changes in behavior, and unfortunately, the understanding was there because we knew that life events will always change consumer shopping patterns. Even when I was at Best Buy, we understood this, that something a big event will change how you shop. But we didn't bake that into our predictive models of things like this. And I kind of described it as it's sort of like a Black Scholes event. That model that was used for predicting stocks back in the 80s and 90s, and then it just tanked during the Asian crisis. It's the same thing that we're going through right now, and data science needs to kind of step up and say, "Hey, how did we go wrong here? How can we make sure this doesn't happen again?" Sure, it may be something that happens infrequently, but recessions come along, every 8 to 10 years. This should be something we would have been able to have things in place to predict how to deal with these much better than we are right now. And the tools are there, they just were not implemented. And I think there's a number of reasons for that. One is just a lack of experience. There's a lot of people now in the field that they were kids during the last recession. Another one is just flawed beliefs often will drive missed insights, and this idea that a lot of leadership, and I don't blame the data scientists for this. I really put this on senior leadership. They did not do their homework in terms of learning what data is. I think they just assume they know when data is really a far more complex area than most CFOs, CEOs really understand. And their whole organizations are paying the price for that lack of learnings that they should have done in the beginning.
I have a question about that for you, because we have a scenario where we have to go out and gather a lot of data. And this goes back to the feedback loop between asking the question of your internal customers and then figuring out how you're going to solve it. You need a particular data set in order to answer that question correctly. Have you ever had to go out and pursue a different data set? Like maybe it's not just like the sales records at Target or something, but you guys have to go create a new data set to answer a particular question that you're chasing after.
Yeah. Just going back to Target in that scenario, one of the projects I was working on was a customer identification platform. Now, this was for identifying customers that did not log in. So how do we actually figure out who these people are? Well, our first party data would not give us that answer. So we needed to go out and understand, well, what data sets would provide that and who has that information? And you're looking at companies like Axiom would collect all the addresses of people, and then can we tie that into location data, and how accurate is that location data? But then also, if you're seeing a concentrated area, is that an apartment building or is that a Starbucks? So we needed not just address data for households, we also needed address data for businesses as well. And I always find there's that aspect of just breaking it down into smaller and smaller chunks and going at the simplistic before the complex. And that's another thing I've run into is a lot of teams, they try to boil the ocean right away. Whereas I always say, let's just start out simple and build our way up. I do a lot of cooking, and whenever I'm trying to replicate a recipe, instead of going to where I want to go with it, I'll always start with the exact recipe and then slowly make modifications to it. So I know where I might have screwed up. So if I just jump right away to, well, this is the end result I want, I don't know if it turns out bad. I don't know what I did wrong because I threw everything on all at once. And I see too many teams, they just want to jump towards that. And sometimes there's that corporate pressure of, well, we need to get to this right away. And it's really up to the leadership of the team to push back and say, you want this done right, or do you want this done fast? One of them's going to give you a good results. One of them, you might get lucky and get good results, but I won't be able to tell you how we got those results. Which do you want? Now, if it's something internal, you might be able to get away with fast. It's something they're presenting out to the street, they might back off because they realize that's a bigger problem for them if they just let it go and they can't explain why. And I find a lot of leadership, they don't want to push back. They just want to say, yeah, sure, we can do that. But that person, it's often been my role, is you have to push back. And like when I was at Target, our initial goal was, let's just get to the household level. And then they said, well, let's figure out who the husband and the wife and the kids are. And I said, let's go talk to legal and the ethics team before we go on to that. And of course, once legal heard that, they were like, no way in hell. Just imagine the pushback we'll get from customers when they realize we can identify the husband and the wife and the kid in the house, even though they never logged in. I said, technically, we could do this. Socially, you don't want to go there because it's just going to create a bad scenario. And I find that's a conversation I constantly end up having in different companies, because once they see the power that they can get with data science, they kind of want to take it to the extreme. And it's like, hey, guys, there's people behind the data. And they may not like what you're doing. You can put in the terms of service saying we could do that, but that doesn't mean people are going to accept it. Particularly at that point in time when, after the data breach at Target, a lot of people were really angry at Target. Doing something like that wouldn't have gone down at all with the majority of customers. So there's often a lot of aspects of the scenario that need to be looked at before really getting into a true answer. And like I said, I find leadership at most companies, they don't understand the complexity of it. They just think, well, you can give me the answer. I always try to, when I go to an organization, I always try to get in early to have a conversation with the legal team, because I find they're going to be my best ally when it comes to those kind of conversations. Because they'll usually listen to their legal counsel in those situations if the legal counsel is saying, you don't want to go down this road. And for me, I find most data science teams, they try to avoid legal like the plague, because they just think, well, they're going to cramp our style. They won't let us do this or that algorithm. And when I was at Best Buy, we always had to do a patent search because, well, you're a big company. You develop an algorithm. Somebody who holds a patent thinks you violate it. They're going to come around looking for money. So early on, we always did patent searches before we started doing any algorithm work to make sure we weren't violating any patents. And it saved the company a ton of money, because we had patent trolls coming after us like every quarter.
Interesting. Do you find that talking to legal departments may give a sense of sort of the moral compass of a company as well?
That depends. Most legal departments that I've run into, this is still new for them, the whole data space, but they want to get involved. So it's really coming in and being a partner with them. Some companies will have an ethics department that's separate from their legal department. And that's really where you'll see they're trying to be more the moral compass for the company. The legal departments are usually just there to make sure you don't get into trouble. And for me, I found that they're very helpful. Like I said, being at big companies, you just get used to being sued. I used to work at 3M in the occupational health and safety division, the most sued division in all of 3M. They would get sued for stuff competitors did that they never even built. That's how much they got sued. It's just something I've learned you just have to do as we're getting. I've got a friend. If you go to Costco and you go to the home page and you see at the top there's this scrolling menu of stuff that goes by. He owns the patent on that. He goes around. He makes a nice living suing companies for violating his patent. And to me, I was like, I didn't even know there was a patent on that. I just thought it was like just something everybody does because it's so prevalent everywhere. And he goes, yeah. And he said he'll never sue Costco because he knows they'll just litigate him into bankruptcy, but he'll go after the mid-sized company because they'll just pay. And that's why I always talk to legal, because I know from experience that is something, if you're a big enough player in the space, people will come at you and try and sue you. And because we would do those patent searches and make sure we didn't make any algorithm that violated a patent, we never paid out. And that's one of the things when it comes to the leadership of the team. You are going to have to think about these things because legal's not normally, in most cases, they're not going to volunteer to do that work for you. You're going to have to tell them this needs to get done, and they're going to be like, "Yeah, I understand. How where do we start? What do we do?" Same thing when I was at Target. It was how do we get involved with the SEC and the tracking of people online, which is something they were trying to do. You want to get involved in those conversations that the SEC has, where they are doing the guidelines for legislation around what you can and can't track online. Those kind of things are important. Or if you're in more regulated industries, what are the regulatory bodies you need to get involved with? It's something I find. I've been in regulated industries, so for me it's kind of normal. But I've seen a lot of data science teams where they just don't think about that, and I've seen where teams are like, "Hey, we just copied the Netflix prize," and I was like, "There's a fee on that, right? You can't just copy the algorithm." And then they'd be like, "Well, we'll just claim it's proprietary secrets." I go, "Well, if it goes to court, good luck, because the judge is gonna say, tough. You're gonna have to show us what's in your code, and if it looks just like the Netflix prize, your odds of paying are going to be 3 to 5 times higher than if you had just said, 'Hey, yeah, we did it. What's the penalty we got to pay?'" Now, I said, and I tell them, I go, "Are you going to fall on your sword for the company and resign or get fired?" I said, because that's really what it's going to come down to. Because if the company loses the lawsuit, they're going to look for somebody to blame. The CEO's not going to take the hit. He's going to come to you, the head of data science, and say, "We're firing you. You should have been on top of that." I said, "Is that really what you want to put yourself into?" So it's really important to get more involved on the legal side of things, in my opinion.
That's interesting. We have about 9 minutes left. What are some parting words for the audience and anyone else who's going to watch this?
I would go back to stories are very important for learning, and they have to be based on real people. I'll often hear people talk about like some fictitious customer, and I'll just be like, "Hey, who is that customer? Can we go talk?" It's like, "Oh, well, this is like somebody who I kind of thought up as like." It's like, "Okay, well, let's find a real person," because I can come up with any fictitious person. I always had like ideals of what customers should be, and then you find out that that's totally wrong. So always base it off real people and get out there and interact as much as possible. I'd also say that particularly now, a passive stance is probably your biggest enemy. It's important to take necessary steps to scan for new developments and opportunities and have an active attitude. I'm talking to a lot of companies, and most of them are just scared to death right now of, they're just saying, "Well, we're just waiting and seeing what's going to happen." When Chuck and I were at Best Buy, there was the year we were both there during the year of the 3 CEOs, and most teams, and at the time everyone was talking about Best Buy is going to go bankrupt, Amazon's going to like totally swallow them up, and a lot of teams were like, "Well, we're just going to wait and see and figure out who's like going to be the permanent CEO and so on." And I was like, "Screw that." You know, who's going to tell us how to do personalization and big data? Some CEO from McKinsey who just got paid like $100 per slide on their PowerPoint? They don't know anything about it. Let's just build this stuff, and when they come in, they tell us we're wrong. Fine, we'll just be like, "Okay, then what do you want?" Then Jolie comes in, and all of a sudden it's like, I'm being told, "Hey, go present to Dirk Schlag and Jolie," and I'm showing them our algorithms. They're like, "Hey, is this for real?" It's like, "Yeah, these things are live." They're like, "You're the first person to come in here to show us something that's actually live." And then all of a sudden, personalization is one of the pillars of the Renew Blue turnaround strategy, and that's how it got up there. Of course, then at that point in time, everybody wanted a slice of it, but before that, everyone just thought it was a backwater project. But that's what you have to do. You really got to have an active attitude, and for me, it's always go out there and constantly look for ways to improve. I've actually seen people talking about they get a new manager on their data science team, and that manager just wants to do exactly what they did at their last company because that's how they saw success. And I think you really got to look at performance improvements as errors and uncertainty plus insights equals performance improvement. And when you look at it that way, improving the standards and controls of errors and uncertainties will lead to incremental insight improvements. And I think that's the most important thing. It's like I've been trying to make sure I don't gain weight during this lockdown. So I have my goal, I have my motivations, but I also created a system of incremental improvements over time. And it's the same thing with in business too. You have to have those systems in place. They got to be designed to allow for experimentation and curiosity, and in a way that doesn't allow you to go down some rabbit hole to some weird end, but keep things within a good process that allows that creativity while keeping improvement is the real driver to everything. And I think also pay less attention to how decisions were made in the past and focus more on giving decision makers room for discovery. I think right now, particularly, like I said, a lot of decision makers, they're scared. If they still have a job, they're scared they might not have a job by the end of summer. So there has to be some room to make it easier to shift plans without getting disorganized. That's really important. I think in any scenario, particularly right now, that's extremely important. And also, don't get hung up on data science. For me, I was in that camp where I was like, data science is the future, data science is king, and I've changed that. Data governance, data philosophy, behavioral science, design, data engineering, social sciences, and marketing. All these pieces have to play together to really have success. Data science, yes, it's going to have its importance, but it's part of, like anything else, it's part of a bigger picture. And I've seen teams where they say, just give it to us, we'll solve everything. It's not going to happen. It really has to be these bigger pieces coming together. And like I said, there's other aspects too I didn't mention, like getting legal involved and so on. They're all part of that equation. But the biggest thing is, I think I try to get senior leadership just to understand data philosophy. If I can get them to understand that, that's going to get you much further along than anything else, in my opinion. Because now you can explain things to them in a way that's easy for most people to understand. It's like, what's going on right now is what we call an atemporal time period. We're not going back to our past, but we haven't figured out what really is the new normal yet. It's an atemporal time period. So when I explain it to executives that way and saying, now you're in a position where you get to define what new normal will be going forward. And they're like, oh, yeah, that makes sense. I get that. I understand that now. Whereas just saying, like, this is the new normal. Well, what the hell does that even mean? Well, define it. Figure out what that is. Hey, maybe, we've got Perkins Restaurant, which was closed. And then they realized, hey, wait a minute. Maybe if we sell food out of here and our pies, we can get people coming back. Well, they created a new way of doing business that allowed them to reopen before other restaurants. That to me is great way of using leadership. And they were looking at data to figure out how do they adapt to this new market. That's a great example, in my opinion.
That's awesome. Does anyone have any questions, comments, pushback? I guess the floor is open to the audience now. We'll let that be open for a few minutes.
Yeah, I have a question. You mentioned getting leadership on board, like understanding data philosophy, but what other things might you do if you walk into a brand new organization and you're trying to kind of build up the data culture within that organization?
I always like talking about data democracy, because what I've seen is if the data team's new, data science, you're going to have other teams that kind of feel like that means they're going to be relegated to sort of the back burner. And like I saw this at Target, where all of a sudden data and digital were king, even though the store is bringing 90% of the revenue. They were kind of relegated to the back burner. And then at C.H. Robinson, when I went there, and they're like, we're building this data practice. And all these other teams are like, well, what about us? And I said, well, the data practice is democratizing data. Whereas before it was locked away and you had to justify why you needed it. we're going to give you the tools, the knowledge to go in there and figure out how to use the data on your own. They loved that because they were like, great, now I can play a bigger role in this. And I think that's really where it comes down to. A lot of people, they'd love to get into the space and do more. They just haven't been shown how. And if the data science team can show people how to do it, because at the end of the day, there's only so many of you can really have. If you can spread out some of that work, and let's face it, some of these domain experts, they don't need some complex like swarm AI. They just may need a simple decision tree that they can build on their own. That's going to help you out and take some of that more mundane work off of your load and let you focus on the things that you feel are more cool, and let them do things that they feel are impactful and showing that they're getting involved. And I've seen that happen over and over again, where it really helps a lot to get into that mode of we're democratizing the data, and it really cuts down on the roadblocks some teams might throw up just because they think you might be cutting into their turf.
You mentioned the need to have a strong, experienced leader in data science teams. This kind of struck a chord with me, having watched data science teams build in a lot of different directions without those guardrails and constraints around architecture and business design, without understanding how to plug into a larger system. Is that something that you've seen a lot?
Yeah. When I was at GE, as a product manager, you needed 10 years of experience just to be even considered. And a lot of people didn't like that, but it made a lot of sense because you were the CEO of your product. It's not like now where you see product owners, which to me are just backlog groomers for the most part. There you are the CEO. I had to decide on what percentage of sales commission the sales reps get, do the budget, work, my own IT team, work with legal, work with the lobbyists and all that stuff. So you really needed to know how to run a business. And at the same time with data science, because you can't go up to your senior leadership and really ask for a lot of guidance, you do need to be that CEO of your space. And that's why having experience is really important. And I find a lot of organizations, they focus so much on like, well, what tools do you know? Can you code this? Do you know this algorithm? And they forget that you're really running a team. It should be, hey, what's your leadership style? How well do you know how to run a P&L? What have you done to produce revenue? How do you engage with customers? What do you do to keep your team engaged and relevant? For me, I've always had this a learning budget. Whether that was brown bag lunches where somebody went to a conference and they're doing a brain dump as to what they learned. And if you came back from a conference and you said, well, I didn't really learn anything, I was like, well, then you're never going to another one again. Not on our dime. I sent somebody to Strata, which isn't cheap. And it's, I went to Strata the year before and I came back with 50 pages of notes. They came back and they said, well, I didn't really learn anything. And I'm like, one, you're not that smart of a person to sit there and say, nothing was new to you. So either you were just hanging out at the parties and getting drunk at the bar, or, this just is too much over your head. Which is it? So, you have to make sure that they go out and learn. But there's also a budget for, doing the online classes, webinars, whatever, and having that progression in there to help them stay relevant. But also one of the things I do when I hire people, I try to assess out of them, how well are they good as a self-learner? So when I hire, I'll ask questions that most people think are just kind of irrelevant. I'll say, hey, what was the last book you read? Tell me about it, and when did you read it? If somebody says, well, I haven't read anything since I was in college, I'm like, yeah, interview's over. Because in this space, I think if you aren't hungry and you aren't going out there and learning constantly, you're going to get stale and out of date really quick. I mean, I just, the data tools we had available to us in 2012, you could easily fit on a slide and read like what they were. Now there's so many tools in the data science space, you can't fit them all on one slide and still read them. So how can you stay relevant if you're not constantly curious? And, as a leader, you really have to foster that curiosity in people. I think it's absolutely critical for your team's success. Without it, I don't give a team much faith in terms of their success long term.
That's awesome. Well, any other questions? Awesome. Well, thanks, Edward. That was a terrific chat. So hopefully everybody got some value out of this. So definitely like a perspective. So to give you some background, Edward and I have been LinkedIn friends for a while, and he was one of the data contrarians that I tend to respect. His opinions and his posts are always enlightening. So, yeah, it's always.
Well,
always
thanks. I try not to drink the Kool-Aid. I've always, whenever you go to a company, I always say, don't drink the Kool-Aid, because you need a good perspective. Same thing when it comes to your professional space. It's, for me, that constant learning, it has to be there. And that's why I've kind of gone down this path. And, a few years ago, I started getting into things like cyber psychology. And even today, people are like, cyber what? And it's like, hey, if you really want to understand data, you really got to understand how people behave, and they don't behave the same in person as they do online. I mean, I don't know anybody who talks like they do on Reddit in real life. Well, okay, a couple people, but most of us don't.
It's a good thing. All right, thank you, Edward. Thanks, Joe, for organizing it. It was great listening. I appreciate it.
Thank you, everyone.
I think we're
Thanks,
looking
guys.
at another lunch around maybe a couple of Fridays from now on June 5th, I believe, or something like that. So we'll stay tuned. And yeah, Edward, thanks again. It's been awesome. So
Thanks.
appreciate it. All right.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.